EUDC 2020. First of all, I'd like to congratulate once again all teams for making it this far. In opening government, we have Leiden C. In opening opposition, we have LCA. In closing government, we have HUJI, and in closing opposition, we have NUA. So again, congratulations to all teams. My name is Ayal, I'll be your chair. With me on the panel are Emily, Ian, Yuna, and Micah. I will now quickly go through the teams, asking me to give me their speaking order and if they wish to state their pronoun introductions as well. Opening government.
Louis speaking first, here day.
Kat, second, she please.
Opening opposition.
Hey, Kira speaking first, no preference.
Hamza speaking second, no preference. Thank you.
Okay. I will say in advance that you will probably have to step a bit closer to the microphone because it was a bit hard to hear you just now. Closing government.
Nete speaking first.
And Miriam is speaking second.
Okay, and closing opposition.
Mukhtar speaking first, Jose, please.
Elishar speaking second, no preference.
Okay. So without further ado, I'm happy to invite the Prime Minister to begin the debate.
Still audible?
Yes, you are.
What we are going to prove is that this means, but by doing this, Israel will create the focus of their enemies on Syria instead of Israel, which is incredibly beneficial to them. As a MEC, we're going to supply the Kurds as Israel with military equipment, with military information, and defend if they are attacked. That is not necessarily boots on the ground, but for example, airstrikes which attack the attacker back, or sort of like stop that attack from happening to the Kurds. Why is this extremely beneficial for the Kurds? Firstly, they just need a lot of stuff. The West supports them normally, but not actually. So it means they need extreme amount of military equipment, especially since they have been fighting for a long time and they desperately need that. And that means that also the economy is not necessarily great, so they don't necessarily have money for themselves. Secondly, predictions about where the next attack is going to be is extremely important for the Kurds. Because they are small, because they're surrounded by enemies, they cannot guard against everybody. That means that they need to know where the next attack is going to be effective at all in defending themselves. Thirdly, they need to be defended. Turkey will likely stop attacking them. For Erdogan, this only bases this on terrorism. The trade-off is going to be different if they know they're against Israel. Corona will weaken them. Corona have weakened Turkey significantly, so they're less likely to do that anyway. You have internal politics, which makes Erdogan weaker and therefore likely to focus on the nation themselves. So they're likely to stop if Israel defends them. I see there's a clarification. Go.
So does it mean that you're going to do things like land operation and military invasions if that is things that are necessary in order to protect Kurds in Syria?
No boots on the ground. We are going to bomb some people, especially, for example, Turkey if they attack. Okay, so focus of enemies. Now the Kurds are currently losing. That's because of Turkey, but most importantly because Assad has consolidated power extremely within that nation. So that means that Assad can have a more direct response to the Kurds, who are the only, or one of the only enemies that they have left. They're a minority. They've been fighting for quite a long time, so they're currently losing. With the support of Israel, they can be extremely strong. The West supports them nominally, but not materially. They also will not do this if Israel will not do this, because they are likely to focus more on the internal politics, as Western states have been doing more in its interventions, have become more unpopular with the voter base in those countries. They will more likely also help if Israel does this. Maybe not with weapons, but at least with money streams and possibly even weapons, which we think is great. That means that the Kurds are even stronger than if only Israel helps them. This, like, also Turkey is just less likely to fight them because they don't want to attack Israel. They don't want to antagonize the West in that. So they're simply not likely to do this. They will not do this. Also, Saudi Arabia supported other groups within that country, but they're currently pulling back. That's firstly because Assad has been consolidating power. So that means that there's other places where there's more to gain for Saudi Arabia than in Syria. They will likely come back if Assad is threatened by the Kurds, or if he has a harder time within Syria, because they absolutely don't want an Israel-backed nation in Syria or an Israel-backed power power in Syria, so they want to screw with Syria then a lot more. That is great for Israel because that means that all the focus, all their enemies will be on Syria. Why is it likely that otherwise they will go to Israel? Firstly, in Yemen, there's very little to gain. So that conflict, they're not going to do it. That's firstly because it's a stalemate. Second, that even if they win, there's simply no government likely because there's not enough food to feed the people. Refugees are pouring out of their country. It's not an economically strong and stable country. And you don't even know whether you're going to get a government. This is unlikely that they're going to pour more resources into Yemen. Secondly, Israel is comparatively weaker. Firstly, because the government there does not have a clear majority. That hampers their ability to do things effectively. That means that they are less able to respond effectively to threats. That means they're less able to take down insurgencies, for example, in Palestine. They are weaker, and like all their enemies, Saudi Arabia and Iran, who are not focusing their attention on Israel, are going to focusing on Israel. Secondly, Corona and it being a democratic state has hurt them more in their ability to do something than comparatively Iran and Saudi Arabia. Secondly, Corona has hit the points of the economy that they depend upon. For example, hospitality much more, which is less harmful in Iran and Saudi Arabia. That means that Israel is comparatively weaker, and you have the enemies who would like to exploit that. But even if they say, yeah, but they're going to also focus attention on other things, we know that Iran and Saudi Arabia can do multiple things at once. They can fund multiple military groups. They can do multiple proxy wars. They've done so in the past, and they're willing to do it, especially if Israel is now currently weaker and they know they have something to gain. This is risk management. You don't want your enemies focusing on you. What can they do? But before I go move on, I think there's a POI from Ayal.
Your model of no boots on the ground actually hurts you because there's a difference between Turkey bombing Israeli soldiers and Israeli funding Kurdish forces.
Sorry? Can you come again?
There's a difference between Turkey targeting Israeli soldiers and Israeli funded Kurdish forces.
Yeah, like whatever. Okay, I think Cadro responded. I don't really understand it. So what can their enemies now do? They can more funding of the groups that bomb in, for example, Palestine. That means Hamas or other extremist groups. That means that there's more cost to, for example, settlements for Israel, which is a harm to Israel if they want to pursue those actions. But also, there's more threat for their settlements and for their existence as a nation, and they basically don't want to be bombed, and you get, and like that material and that money is mutually exclusive. They can supply weapons. Why is it mutually exclusive? Iran and Saudi Arabia have big pockets, but they don't have endless pockets. They are currently strategically choosing their conflicts and where they want to focus on. If they don't focus on Syria, because Assad is consolidating power and there's nothing to gain anymore, and Syria as well will focus, like Syria as a government will also be against Israel. That will be an incredible harm to Israel. It will weaken that state. It will make it likelier that bombings occur, that Israeli citizens will die. And those are the things that we should prevent in this debate. Therefore, OG.
I thank the Prime Minister, and I'm happy to call upon the Leader of Opposition.
Hey, is my mic okay?
Yes.
Yes, awesome. I just want to note that apart from all the defensive content, I think the only positive benefit about why this benefits Israel from opening government is displacing focus from other from other countries and doing this. I think this is going to have to be weighed against all the ways in which this makes Israel incredibly vulnerable. This is an actor motion. It's not about what's best for the Kurds. It's only about what's best for the Kurds to the extent that benefits Israel, which is why a lot of this debate pivots on that comparison rather than would this be good for them or would this be not for them. Arguing cases about why this makes Israel vulnerable such that it's not worth any of the benefits. That's my main response to opening government, which is I don't think it engages with this clash. But the second main response to opening government, which is talking about how this de-escalates conflict, is I just don't think they give reasons why Turkey will stop or Turkey will back down, because Turkey was in the conflict first and now it's Israel intervening. I think this is much more likely to escalate and they're likely to reciprocate for a few reasons. A, because it's seen as more invasive when Israel get involved in their conflict, but also because they're willing to invest more, because the Kurds are more geopolitically pivotal to their geostrategic agenda than it is for Israel with the Kurds. So I think this is likely to escalate, and then it's going to be exponentially keep escalating in ways which Israel probably isn't able to sustain, because as opening government said, it's politically unstable right now. Note, House's POI was important because if they're not supporting boots on the ground, international escalation won't happen, and scrutiny won't happen, because the optics stay exactly the same, because Turkey isn't killing Israeli soldiers, Turkey is killing its Kurds who are funded by Israel. So I think you lack that scrutiny there when that's not happening. I also think this means that Israel is likely to be significantly not as strategically invested, because Kurdish lives are significantly more expendable to them. I think there's lots of reasons why this is going to happen badly. But let's go on to the framing about why we think this is going to happen badly and what we support. Because OG, you're right, there's massive domestic political instability in Israel right now, in terms of just barely following a coalition, in terms of Netanyahu being investigated by the Supreme Court. In opening opposition, we think at best Israel should not be involved and stay away from this, because it's just not vigilant to their incentives. But if it does want to be involved, it should ramp up border controls to mitigate the spillover effects, and basically put all its resources in defending itself against the spillover effects in this conflict, as opposed to making a geostrategic alliance, which makes it significantly more vulnerable. So we think the comparative is protecting themselves, insulating themselves, not being involved in conflict. A couple of pieces of framing about why this will probably go badly and that we did it a good way. I think firstly, just trivially, it's important to point out that Israel lacks good experience funding guerrilla groups, because it's done conflict in terms of more around funding security and intelligence forces, using intelligence to destabilize regimes, or conventional warfare. It lacks experience in funding proxy conflicts like guerrilla forces, such as Iran does with Hezbollah, for example. So I think that's a weakness there. But secondly, I don't think this is going to get political buy-in inside Israel, because you're funding a Muslim group. So people are going to be like, if we're being screwed by a pandemic, if we have a politically unstable system, why are you deflecting our resources to a geostrategic alliance which are not pivotal to us? I think the people, Israeli populations, is going to be more politically palatable to focus on self-defense and making sure they're insulated from spillover conflict, as opposed to investing resources in a conflict elsewhere, which they don't see as specifically pivotal. I think the impact of this is if there's likely to be political instability or different political instability, or not everyone buying into this, it means that there's going to be a lack of sustainability over this kind of policy and over the strategic alliance. So it probably makes it more dangerous if you escalate conflict and then pull out. That looks much worse in Israel and exacerbates the problems they want to talk about. But why does this make Israel more vulnerable? I'm going to go through just the actors that I think are important in this debate and analyze why this significantly makes Israel much more of a target. Firstly, in terms of ISIS, because obviously they're a target right now, but I think Israel make themselves a much more strategic target when ISIS can't get gains without unbidding Israel, because they're likely to escalate, because they want to intimidate Israel out of funding the Kurds. So now you add another strategic incentive for ISIS to launch attacks on Israel, because that's the way in which you get them to back down and make it easier to fight against the Kurds. So this makes them significantly more vulnerable. That's a risk you're not likely to take if you're already politically unstable. Secondly, I do think it's important to point out this makes Israel more of a vulnerable target to Hamas, because every penny that goes towards the Kurds is money detracting from security and protection around guarding settlements, which does make it more vulnerable for attacks on Hamas, which is harder to defend. Again, this is about what Israel should prioritize, given there's lots of ways it can be unstable and where we should focus resources, where we should focus capital. Note, even in opening government's world, if they really cared about this, it's just really, really hard to fight the Assad regime and ISIS, because ISIS is a guerrilla force, which means you can't destroy them, you must reduce them, because they're very spread out and flexible, they're not geographically concentrated. So this is a very hard goal they're giving this military strategic alliance to give, which I think is why it's likely to be difficult. I think secondly, also, it's very unlikely that all the Kurds will have buy-in to the strategic alliance. First of all, because there's a massive skepticism towards from people with Muslims and Jews and different ideological beliefs. The perception is skepticism about why are we being funded when we're at different ends of it in different ideological ways. But I think secondly, part of the reason that the Kurds are so screwed and so spread out right now between different countries is because of the Israeli settlement lines that were drawn in the 1920s, which displaced a lot of them. The impact of this is that even if some Kurds agree and join the strategic alliance, you're not likely to get mass buy-in and support. You're likely to get factionalization within the strategic alliance, because people feel distrust, people feel skeptical. Even if you don't get that, it's likely to be ineffective, because there's massively competing interests between what Israel want and what the Kurds want, because they, apart from this one common thing which they're fighting against, which is ISIS and Assad, they do have different strategic incentives, so we're likely to use the conflict in different ways, which I don't think makes for an effective conflict, and it doesn't justify the vulnerabilities that it presents on Israel. I think the second the next actor, which it makes Israel incredibly vulnerable to, is Iran, because this is one of the only allies left of the Assad regime, right? And even if Israel goes in with the sole intention of taking out ISIS, which I think is not likely, they probably will take the Assad regime, but even if that's true, the perception is that Israel will be entering their proxy war territory. For example, like Iran's funding Hezbollah. Note, like Iran is Israel's nemesis. You know, we have like Ayatollah making anti-Semitic remarks about being very against Israel ideologically. This is going to be perceived as them invading in their proxy conflict and stepping on them, which makes them much more of a strategic target. Note, the proposed nuclear program in Iran is to counterbalance Israel, which means this is massively politically sensitive, which means you're much more likely to get a reaction from them and makes them more vulnerable, which isn't a risk Israel should take, given how unstable it is right now. Closing government, I will take you if you have a POI.
Every few months, Israel bombs long-range missiles that are being moved through Syria to Lebanon and Iran. Why do they do this?
I mean, you can tell me. Okay, so the implications of this argument about Iran, all of these arguments are like, firstly, Israel is much more vulnerable to aggressive because it's provoking these different actors. But secondly, the military alliance necessarily needs to exponentially escalate because Iran is more likely to pour lots of resources to this because that proxy war spending is massively important to this, which just means you get a massive escalation of conflict. So first of all, we just don't think this risk is enough to take, such that Israel shouldn't prioritize its own security and making it more vulnerable to attacks and vulnerable to volatile actors. But I also just think Israel can't afford to be in this conflict like long term to the extent that Iran can keep investing it, to the extent that Turkey can keep investing in it, which means the conflict necessarily escalates and grows much worse, which amplifies all of the impacts I've given you about the different actors who are likely to be against Israel and make Israel significantly more vulnerable. I think this debate is about specifically what Israel's strategic priorities should be, and to the extent that they can protect their own borders from conflict without creating a strategic alliance, which creates lots of incentives to backlash against them, gets them involved in a war and a proxy conflict, which necessarily escalates exponentially beyond their control and beyond what is sensible. This is a very bad idea. I thank you, everyone.
I thank the Leader of Opposition. I'm happy to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Cool. 3, 2, 1. A bit of direct response, then weighing in terms of why this actually effectively represents the interest of Israel. 1, on the idea that Turkey stays in the conflict because Israel is invading in their proxy war, regardless of how much that sounds like a teenage girl problem. I'm going to talk about why it's actually relatively insignificant to this debate to the degree that opening opposition have proven it. 1, to the degree that Israel is only interfering in Syria, note where they're already to some extent active, where they are already engaging to some extent in activities, I think it is relatively unclear what the delta is. But note that specifically the reason why Turkey is likely to leave the Kurds particularly more alone than it has so far is because they can expect lower benefits from attacking them, right? Because you have a situation where they are likelier to be able to repel attacks because, as Louis already points out and gets no response, they will be able to predict them and invest their resources in the way that maximally defends against them, because it is likelier that they will be able to at least at points defeat Turkish forces, because Turkish forces enter the risk of being subject to Israeli airstrikes. I think all of that means that you have a lower potential chance of success while incurring a higher risk, meaning that in any kind of reasonable calculus, and I think Turkey is engaging in a reasonable calculus here, it is less of a smart idea to be interfering there. But even to the degree Turkey is not engaging in a rational calculus there, I think there's an additional ideological risk of humiliation at the point where the Kurdish alliance is able to defeat a Turkish army, because they are a terrorist group. At the point where a terrorist group in the Turkish framing is able to defeat your army, that means that your army looks bad. That means that you look weak. That means that you cannot use that ideologically and domestically in order to position yourself as a strongman. I think that means you want to avoid that humiliation and therefore invest less resources in seeking to get it. Let's talk about the idea of this making Israel more vulnerable. 1, I think opening opposition has not explained to me what the specific relevance is of investing this particular set of military resources. No, Louis explains it quite clearly what it is. 1, a lot of that is not a mutually exclusive pool of resources, i.e. military intelligence, where specifically you are going to get attacked, is not something that is mutually exclusive. Israel still has that information when it has given it away. But secondly, to the degree that there is mutually exclusive resources in terms of airstrike time, in terms of weaponry that you're giving away, I think Israel has immense military capacity, has immense technological capacity, has a huge army, partly due to conscription, at which point I'm unsure why the specific delta in military capacity would leave Israel more vulnerable to the degree that it would actually land them in danger. But secondly, I think that you have a situation where at the point where, as Louis points out, also no response, by the way, at the point where Israel is supporting the Kurds and more people expect the Kurds therefore to do well, I think the West is more likely to be willing to invest in it because it doesn't seem like a losing strategy to be doing so. Because it means that even if it's literally just Israel giving them weapons and the West giving them money, you still wind up with them doing relatively better, which means Israel will probably in the long run need to invest relatively little of themselves, at least like in terms of charity. Maybe they'll keep selling, but that's something that I'm not necessarily sure hurts them. Let's talk about Israeli population, why I don't think this is actually something that makes them angry, and therefore it is not as unsustainable as Kiara wants it to be. One, Israel considers Syria irrelevant. I know this sounds like I'm being incredibly mean right now, but I think it's absolutely ridiculous to claim that Syria is not something that is considered as being strategically significant for Israel. There's a land border and there is a risk of having a stable Iran proxy in government there that will have just won a military conflict in his own country, that has shown the willingness to be incredibly violent regardless of international attention on that. Note, like, poison gas is something that we considered to be relatively rare because of how horribly it is looked on in international attention. Assad was clearly willing to do this regardless. I think the idea that we want Assad to be stable in Syria is something that's absolutely ridiculous. I also think that the Israeli population is probably smart enough that you can communicate that, because I honestly think, one, if we can come up with it in 15 minutes of prep, it's probably not hyper complex. And secondly, I think it's also something that is a relatively common ideological idea, that at the point where you're defending yourself against one, Assad, and two, ISIS, specifically on a territory where if they establish a solid foothold, they will be much more of a threat to you than if they continue to be in contention with each other, and if they cannot rely on being able to build stable military supply lines there, being able to build like solid bases for bombings. I think that's probably something you can sell to your population as a core strategic interest. We don't care if we win. We don't have to win. We have to keep Syria contentious and unstable enough that it cannot pose this risk. I think we do that. We've got no response to why we cannot do that. We don't give a fuck about winning it. We don't think, what the fuck would winning even be? Like, Syria won't be Kurdish. Okay, let's talk about the idea that we're seen as aggressive and then go into weighing. One, I think Israel is seen as aggressive in status quo. I think Israel building settlements is seen as aggressive. I think Israel's policy toward Palestinians is seen as aggressive. I think basically anything Israel does will be interpreted as aggressive by anti-Israeli media. I think that's something that's probably not exclusive. I think at that point, all of the harms of it are not relevant to this debate. Before moving on, opening up.
Considering that Erdogan has hinged his entire foreign policy agenda on taking out the Kurds, won't it be a bit humiliating to pull out the moment the Israelis come in?
I don't think you need to pull out the moment the Israelis come in. I think you can gradually invest less resources in it at the point where presumably they're still getting pummeled by other people. I also don't necessarily think that at the point where you don't prove to me that Erdogan can actually achieve the benefits of pummeling the Kurds in Syria, at the point where Israel is supporting them, that he continues to be in there, because like, it's probably better to pull out than to be defeated. I think this is intuitive ideologically. Why do we think this effectively manages risk for Israel? One, I think that there's a massive commitment to not having Syria fall by Iran, which means that they will invest as many resources in that as they have to in order to make sure that Assad has control. Those resources are not going toward groups that are currently endangering Israeli settlements. Those resources are not going toward bombing Israel. Those resources are not going toward funding like subversion within the Israeli state. We think that's pretty good. But secondly, you also refocus Saudi Arabian resources into Syria, which we think is ultimately significantly better because one, it prevents Assad from being stable, but two, it prevents those same resources from also being leveraged against Israel. Why is that true? One, there's a mutual exclusivity of resources. Secondly, it is much easier for both of these to claim propaganda-relevant victories against Israel in Syria than it is to claim them in Israel. We think at the point where you have Israel present in Syria, that means that any victory that Iran or Saudi Arabia score against them there incrementally is likely to be, one, likelier to achieve because there aren't boots on the ground, but also because the Israeli military probably will not invest its all into it, which means it's just mathematically easier to do. But also it's just clearer incremental victories. You don't have to destroy an entire state. You just have to defeat them in one skirmish. I think that's something that you're likely to be able to achieve, even if you're just shooting at the Kurds, right? I think that means that the propaganda benefits of it are much more significant. That means that that is where you focus your resources because it's easier to do that than to attack Israel itself, and it's also less risky. Panel, this is effective risk management. Propose.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister, and I'm happy to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Before I start, I think this is important to say the Kurds are some of the most unfortunate people on this planet. So if I say anything which violates their sensibilities, I am very sorry. That was a nice case shift by Deputy Prime Minister. But think of how counterintuitive their case is. They are saying the point at which Israel intervenes in Syria, Saudi Arabia and Iran's attention is diverted from Israel. How is that even true? Like, if a country is now entering your Cold War proxy territory, don't you attack the country as opposed to being distracted by a silver and nickel? Like, I just think this is the most counterintuitive argument I have ever heard in my life. You attack the country which has literally entered the territory in which you're fueling a conflict for the past 8 years. I legitimately don't think this argument stands in the debate. I want to make 3 points in this speech. One, will Israel do this successfully? I think there was no engagement on Kira's massive mechs for why Israel simply doesn't have experience in funding guerrilla groups, like the United States does with the Afghan Mujahideen, like Iran does with Hezbollah, like several other Latin American states do with drug nexus terror groups. This means that even if Israel has incentives to do this, it will likely not do this well because its focus has usually been on Five Eyes style intelligence and conventional warfare. But secondly, they won't have domestic buy-in. There was no response to this except to say this is good for Israel's geostrategic goals. Really, funding Muslims during a politically unstable time, during the coronavirus pandemic and the economic instability, let's fund some Muslim groups right now. I think that really works well for domestic buy-in. I think realistically what's going to happen is that right-wing groups are going to say we should stay out of this conflict and not intervene in it. But thirdly, they missed completely Kira's argumentation about the Kurds not having buy-in. Literally, one of the main reasons why the Kurds are factionalized right now within 4 countries is because of the Disraeli settlement signed in 1924. They have a historic rivalry with Israel, and there's also huge theological differences between the Kurds and Israel, which means that even if they can fiat that some Kurds sign up, likely the most extreme ones, such as the PKK, are realistically not going to have buy-in into this sort of maneuver. The second point I really want to look at is how do the rest of the allies and enemies of Israel interact with this motion? The first thing I want to point out, which I think is really important in this debate, is that Turkey becomes significantly more pissed off. Their only response to this was Turkey can't hold off Israel. Why is this true? Do you have to prove that Israel is a much more capable military actor than Turkey is? There was no analysis here. Realistically, what's going to happen is that Erdogan, who's getting fucked in the polls, is doing the Putin-style maneuver of intervening in another country. Good job, Erdogan. It's so humiliating, the point at which you pull out because another actor who is a geopolitical rival comes into that space. If anything, all of Erdogan's intentions are going to be about doubling down in this region as opposed to pulling out. But secondly, no response to Kira's mechanisms of how their model works against them, because you can bomb Kurds and not bomb Israeli soldiers. If there are no Israeli boots on the ground, they literally get no international scrutiny out of it. The third point I make about international allies then is that Israel actually loses international buy-in. A, the US has already pulled out of this conflict, your major ally, so they're not going to help you out. Secondly, Israel already faces international condemnation because of the building of settlements. It's unclear to me why they want to violate the sovereignty of another country and get some more people hating them. I think that makes no sense. But number 4, I just want to point out that in terms of Iran, it's crucial to understand that Iran will now see this as another territory to fight Israel on. This is a comparative debate. Saying Iran hates Israel anyway is a bullshit argument, because if someone hates you more, that's probably bad for you. This is realistically what we said, that right now what's happening is that Iran has one front against Israel, which is basically to fund Hezbollah. What we said was that the reasonable thing to do is protect your borders, secure your borders. This takes out every single benefit on opening government side, insofar as we're able to successfully prove to you that if your only argument is that this conflict might spill over to Israel or Hezbollah might enter Israeli territory, this is the reason why you should put dollars into enforcing your border rather than actively instigating Iran and Saudi Arabia and other countries within the region by making yourself a target. Before I move on towards the 5th point with international buy-in, I am extremely happy to take closing government. Please, closing government. Okay, no, opening government. Anyone doesn't
Look,
fucking matter.
we
Yeah,
think
go
that
on.
it's probably true that Syria and Saudi Arabia have interest in attacking Israel regardless. We have given them a playing field where they can secure easier victories and do so in a more propaganda effective way. Why wouldn't they do that and therefore hurt Israel less in reality?
Okay, no, but like this is premised on the fact that like Israel has more at stake than these countries do. I've shown to you that the raison d'etre of the Irani and Turkish foreign policy is to make sure that they A, take out the Kurds, and B, prop up Assad's regime. You're entering a conflict in which actors are significantly more invested than you are and are significantly more capable at taking down these groups than you are. I just think that's really important to point out. The sixth point I want to mention is in terms of the weird point of information that CG gave us, and then they still not giving us our extension, which was, oh no, you know, you lob missiles at Lebanon, Iran all the time. Why do you do this? Okay, let's think about it geostrategically. You have two neighbors which you might piss off. You have Syria and you have Lebanon, and Iran is separated from you geostrategically. What happens now? You have huge incentives to pool your forces at the Israeli border for the same reasons that opening government gave, that you want to distract Israel's attention from the Syrian conflict. So literally the reasons that they gave for why Israel would do this are the reasons for why Iran and Saudi Arabia and Lebanon and all these places would attempt to attack Israel to create a pincer level effect to distract from them. Their reasons are in fact more powerful in terms of targeting Israel than Israel is in terms of targeting other actors. I just think that's really important to point out. So the sixth point I say, which I think is really important to point out in terms of international buy-in, is that fundamentally other actors also start stepping in who are not necessarily on your side. They're forgetting that Russia, an actor, is already propping up Assad's regime. I'm going to intuit that Russia has a bit more money than Israel does and a bit more incentive to keep its only geostrategic ally in the Middle East propped up. You can shake your head, that's not a response. But number 7, it's important to understand that right now it's a Shia regime versus a Sunni regime conflict because they're trying to prop up a Shia regime. You literally unite all Arab powers to systematically take out Israel, the point of which becomes a Jewish conflict versus a Muslim conflict. But finally, panel, I just want to point out that this fucks the Kurds because what they've forgotten is Kira's initial framing. The Kurdish forces have been decimated by Turkey since September 2019 when Trump pulled out his forces. A, how are these forces going to be capable of achieving their geostrategic goals, considering they're being hammered by ISIS on one hand and being plundered and pillaged, and secondly, also being topped by airstrikes on Turkey. But secondly, if the Kurds are a moral stakeholder in this debate, this makes their life significantly worse. You paint a fucking target on their back by literally every single neighbor in the Middle East, including Russia. The only thing this does is screw them up more, not less. Panel, I've shown to you that Israel is not a capable actor with the right incentives to intervene here. The alternative in our world is to make sure that you protect your borders and protect your settlements. And finally, this is so much worse for the Kurds. I'm very proud to oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition. I'm happy to call upon the Member of Government.
Look, HUJI come and tell you that the reason this is good for Israel is because now all of Israel's enemies are going to be so focused on Syria, they can no longer focus on harming Israel. I will give you several responses for why this might not be a very good explanation for how Israel is going to overcome its strategic difficulties. We are going to explain, first of all, what is actually the actual strategic difficulties that Israel is having in Syria, what does it care about, what does it not care about, and actually give you the realistic mechanisms for why this alliance is going to help them overcome a lot of the difficulties that are having. Right? So, first of all, a few points of rebuttal. Look, we don't have any experience with guerrilla fighting as a result. This is going to fail. We have no idea why this is true. We have no idea why you need specific experience for guerrilla fighting. They have zero analysis on this. We think if you have a lot of money, you have a lot of technology, you have better intelligence, all of these things, probably you can do a much better job. We think that Israel probably has a lot of this thing to do. We think that Israel even have some advantages over Russia in terms of technology. And we also think that it is much more invested by the fact that they are physically here and they have much more incentive in this area. And as a result, probably are going to succeed in doing a lot. Then they tell us, look, there's going to be no domestic buying. We think, oh, the Kurds hate us or whatever. We think this is just not true. We think that actually the Israeli population very much support the Kurds. Even like right-wing politicians like Miri Regev have come out and said that oppression and occupation are terrible in the context of the Kurds, although supporting it in the context of Israel, because they just think the Kurds are, they don't like Syria, they don't like Iran, they don't like all their enemies. The Kurds are against their enemies, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And Israeli politicians understand this very well. And then they tell us, oh, the third thing is that we're going to lose the Western support because we are supporting the Kurds. We have no idea why this is true. Again, we think the West also like the Kurds and we're going to at least not care that we are helping them. So all of this makes no sense, or the reasons for why this is not going to work. We think that we are likely to be able to aid them significantly. Then one more thing we do want to rebut extremely is this idea that Turkey is going to attack us, right? We think that this is highly unlikely. We think that if we tell the Kurds we're going to supply you with a lot of military equipment to make sure that you can actually succeed now, in exchange for stopping the terror attacks in Turkey, it is very likely that they are going to agree, and thus we are reducing Turkey's aggressions. But second of all, we think that we are also much stronger than Turkey, right? They don't have that much of an army, definitely not that much of the technological and intelligence abilities of Israel. So we just think that they understand that getting into a fight with Israel is not a good idea for them. Let's talk about Israel's interests, right? Because we think that Syria, there are several bodies. We hear a little bit in the first house. We want to make sure this is orderly, right? So first of all, Iran, which is funding a lot of rebel groups within Syria. Assad himself highly dislikes Israel and would like to destroy it. Is unable to destroy it, but still is very aggressive towards Israel and would like it obviously not to be there because of all the historical failures making Israel go away. And Hezbollah, which is coming from Lebanon into Syria at the point where there is no leadership. Right now, what can these groups do? Right? Because unlikely any of them can take out Israel at the point where it has a very strong army and all the abilities that we said and capabilities. They just to protect themselves. Why does Israel still care, right? So, so first of all, just to before that, to clarify why we think it is highly unlikely anybody is actually going to attack us and try to destroy us. So, first of all, according to many sources, Israel is a nuclear power. We can't completely guarantee this is true, but we think it is highly likely to be true. Second of all, we think that we have a very strong army and very technologically advanced. We have the support of many. We buy the best technology from the United States as well, and all of those things. We think that just is very unlikely. But what can happen to us? So first of all, we think that when you have people on the border who are a danger to you, they can do things which military capabilities find it hard to deal with, right? Because you need to invest money in order to solve things. And if people are just throwing missiles at you from like random small missile launchers they built up in their backyard, like happens with Gaza, that is something that is very hard to deal with technologically or with a strong arm. Right? And we think that is something that is very harmful to Israel. Attacking soldiers that are patrolling the borders and making that much less safe, and also hurting the people of Israel because they support the military, right? What we say in the POI, which is crucial, is moving weapons and equipment through Syria towards Iran, often coming through the sea, and then that is to Syria's ports, and that is how they move it and get it to Iran. And this is something that Iran can use to further its incentives. Iran is against Israel, right? First of all, obviously, both sides of the first house agree with this. We think that even if they don't attack us, they can still again have these border skirmishes with us once over the Syrian border. They can have cyber attacks and things like that. And also because we are trying to forge closer ties with Saudi Arabia. And the more Iran is strong, the worse it is for us. And we think these stronger ties with Saudi Arabia are going to be very important for making sure we can continue to oppress Palestinians in the future. So we think that for all these reasons, probably, Israel's incentives is to prevent specifically these types of things from happening, not an all-out attack, but the types of border skirmishes and so on and so forth. Before we continue about how we actually do this,
If your analysis about Israel being a military superpower and having nuclear weapons is true, why does opening government's main argument say that you need to protect vulnerable Israel from Iran?
I don't think that's exactly what they said, and we think that we have reality on our side. Okay, so first of all, we think that intelligence is super important for preventing the type of things that Israel cares about, which we just described, right? We think that if you put tiny planes, I don't remember what they're called, into Syria, then Syria shoots them down, and therefore reconnaissance is very hard, right? We also think that it is very hard for you to intercept communication networks at the point where you don't have direct access, for example, to this fight.
Netta, you have cut off. Netta, you have cut off. I've stopped my clock. Am
I audible?
Yes, you are now audible. You're on. Okay. You should be audible only with your computers. I have stopped the clock at 5:40. Last thing was about intercepting communications and that is being harder.
Intercepting communications, 5:40, יש לי כאילו דקה ו20. אוקיי. Restart, okay. Sorry, some internet connection problem. I hope I'm fine now. Okay. So 3, 2, 1. So intercepting communications is super important, as we said, because you need direct access to the fiber optic lines, and you need direct access to the just range where the radio is. We think that it's you need to understand what is going on in Syria all the time and its specific details in order to intercept the weapons that are coming through it and going towards Iran, in order to make sure that you can actually control the things that are happening there. We think that what we're getting by cooperating with the Kurds is exactly that we have, first of all, the internal information, the ability to take the pictures and to notice what is going on in the ground just because they're physically there, the ability to intercept communications much more effectively, and just many people who have a very good grasp of the language, have a very good grasp of the culture, find it much easier to give you information that you might not have even noticed, give you information that interpret it in a way that makes more sense because you don't have all the background that is required. 2, we think that when you become an active part of what is going on in Syria, it is just you are part of the negotiations. What does this mean? In the status quo, Netanyahu has gone to Russia and told them, you cannot let Iranians be on our borders. And Putin was like, whatever, I don't care about you. Why are you talking to me? You are not involved in this in any way. We think that at the point where we are supporting the Kurds and are part of the same alliance as them, that means that we are a member on the negotiation table. That means that when there is negotiations of what is happening in Syria, one of the things that is taken into account in these negotiations is exactly the idea of we need not to have the Iranians on our borders and Hezbollah on our borders, right? We think that means that when I'll tell you the most important thing for us is to make sure our borders are not attacked, we are much more able to do this on our side of the house than on their side of the house. For all these reasons, please propose.
The member of opposition, I'm happy to call upon the government whip.
Okay, from here, I guess, do you want the video?
No, it's all good. They can see me here, they can hear me on the other thing. Everything is great. Okay. I will begin in 3, 2, 1. This is not a debate about resources. This is not a debate about where people focus. This is not a debate about countries that already hate us, hating us a little bit more, and for some reason that wasn't analyzed, that changing their calculus. This is about the strategic importance of having a presence inside Syria and the way in which we can actually stop the very real threats that exist against the stability and safety of the Israeli public. That is what we are defending in today's debate. We're going to talk about this on 2 levels. 1, about the success of this mission, and 2, about the importance and what we're actually changing, and that is how it begins. Before that, let's engage with what we just heard from closing, because they basically said the West are going to abandon us over this, and obviously if we stop getting funding for all our things and weaponry, that would be terrible. Several reasons why this is not going to happen. 1, the West is very, very pro-Kurd, right? This is the narrative that has been put out. This is like, it's true that the US stopped supporting them at some point, but that's still the way in which the public views it. It's still shown that this is, among other things, because they're an oppressed people, that people buy into that narrative, but also because their enemies are ISIS and Assad, the literal worst humans basically in the world, except for like North Korea. No one is supportive of these people, and no one thinks that supporting them is a bad idea. That doesn't give you a lot of political capital to use this as an excuse to stop supporting Israel or anything else, versus say all the other terrible things that Israel are actually doing. Second of all, we tell you that in terms of like pissing off their allies that they talked about is Russia and Turkey. These are not currently allies of the West. These are not people that the West has strong incentives to protect or to care about. They're currently enemies of the West. We don't see why this is a thing that's going to make a difference. But thirdly, just let's understand the difference of the strategic importance. Israel is massively strategically important to the EU and to the United States because they are a place where there's a ton of trade, and the stability of the ports and access to that is massively important. The only democracy in the Middle East which ensures their stability and continued existence there and continued insurance that they will have access to those things. They have massive access to intelligence on their enemies. That is to say, Iran and Syria and other Russian satellites that these countries want to have intelligence on and want to have access to being able to ensure that they don't get more power in the Middle East. That is why they care about that. 3, they have important technology and weaponry that they share and they support between those people. Even if we're in some way like annoying the West, which we don't think we're even doing a little bit, the extent to which we're doing that versus the extent to which we're massively strategically important to them, we just don't think this is a likely scenario. C, go out. Let's talk about the rest of this debate. 1, why is this this mission going to be successful? Opening opposition trying to tell us, look, what you're going to get is a massive amount of buy-in from Turkey and from Russia and etc. That are going to put in a lot of money to attempt to fight this, and Israel can't fight back. One, we tell you, we think this is simply untrue. We think that Israel is an incredibly powerful actor with incredibly powerful technology and money. They have the capability to do this. But more, we think they're going to change the incentives on the ground here. Because let's understand, Turkey is the biggest actor who is fearful of the Kurds right now because they are terrorists, because they are afraid of them actually attacking them. With Israel as mediators and with giving them strong incentives to the Kurds and being able to protect them and say, we're going to keep you alive, we're going to give you massive technology, we're going to give you massive agricultural technology and economic stability and etc. That is the point at which we can convince and mediate and ensure the Kurds say, okay, we will not be terrorists to Turkey, we will stay where we are, and then we reduce the opportunity for Erdogan to do this. He can also sell this as a PR win if this is what opening opposition want in terms of having solved this and ensured the stability and safety of his people. Israel acting as that mediator and giving them that power means that they don't have the massive incentive and interest to do this. It is worthwhile for them to do this and take that PR win as opposed to entering into a battle with a very, very powerful nation who is funding these people, who also is likely to get other Western people to fund these people. We think this is very, very important. Similarly, it's true of Russia, who do not care if Kurds also exist inside Syria. What they care about is ensuring a basic stability and Assad's continued rule so they have access to it. Again, Israel can act as a mediator here. Why are Kurds still going to take this? Because the second thing they told us, Kurds are going to take this because at the end of the day, they are currently under existential threat and are very likely to be wiped off the map. Israel is offering them a lifeline and a very, very serious one. And they have massive amounts of weaponry, of technology, of all of these things to give them this stability, and it is worthwhile for them to take it because otherwise they are literally going to be killed. We think that this is a very likely scenario for them because we ensure their stability, we ensure their safety, and this is the thing that they're going to take. Also, if they just disagree, then we have no motion, and then like, cool, okay. Then the last thing they tell us is no domestic buy-in. Like Annette already tells you, this is just critically not true, and that people in Israel understand that not all Muslims are the worst, and that their enemies like ISIS and Syria are much, much, much worse than them, and that they're perfectly happy to fund them if they can explain strategic importance. We don't see this as a big problem. So we think this is going to succeed. We think we're going to be able to get this. Let's understand why this is critically important and what we get out of it. Because opening tried to tell you, look, HUJI tried to tell you, we're changing the focus of this thing, right? We're going to take our enemies from focusing on us and move them to somewhere else. They get told, first of all, we just don't understand the extent to which this is mutually exclusive. That is to say, this is predicated on the idea that for some reason the other countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran, they have such limited funding, this is going to make a difference to their ability to also fund Hamas or people on the border, and the extent, we don't understand why this is true. Second of all, they get told it's not clear why this actually changes the focus and doesn't increase the focus on you when you are now actively more funding the enemy. Insofar as they recognize this as being a thing, they have more of a reason to attempt to destabilize you. This is what opening opposition tells them. Opening opposition themselves then tell them, look, but now this gives extra incentive for Saudi Arabia and Iran to try and kill you because they already hate you, but now they hate you more. So that has to be worse, right? That's a quote from Hamza. No, that doesn't have to be worse. If they already hate you to the max, it is not clear what +1 hate does to their incentives. If they have the capabilities to destabilize, if they have the capabilities to murder Israeli citizens, if they have the capabilities to actually attack us, they're already going to do it in the status quo. Netta comes in and explains to you why this limits their capabilities. Before I go into reminding you of exactly what that analysis is, I will take opening. Yes.
The Kurds have been abandoned by America thrice in the past century. Now you have a US Jewish ally asking to support you. Will they trust you?
Look, like again, we think that if they literally just don't trust us at all, then we tried, we failed, we move out, okay, end of the debate. This debate is predicated on the idea that you get enough buy-in from enough people for there to be any kind of difference here, or else sure, like the debate just doesn't exist. Okay, cool. There's just also just no harm in that. We offered, they said no, cool. What do we actually get given the risks in here? What we get at the end of the day is access to intelligence on the things that really matter. That is to say, for example, long-range missiles that are getting to Hezbollah and Iran and have the capability of actually threatening and getting to the heart of Israel in a way that we can't fight back against. This gives us intelligence on them for all the reasons that Netta tells you about. It also gives us access to military bases and troops on the ground there that are not ours, that can make the excursions in order to take them out and attack those things in an easier way than we have right now, and will not get shot down from the air. As Netta tells you, it gives us much more, wow, I can't read my own handwriting. It gives us much more negotiating power against Russia in terms of what they allow and don't allow people to put on our borders, in terms of things that can actually threaten our citizens, to build tunnels into the north and actually come in and murder the people who are living there. We think that all of these things, it's not about the question of shifting the focus, which does not change in either side of this debate. It is about literally the strategic capabilities that we're getting in terms of stopping the things that can actually threaten our country. We think that these things are the most dangerous things that Israel faces, because a little more funding to Hamas, that we have every capability of stopping under, under the status quo, that we have every capability, that we are way, way more powerful than, is nothing compared to the extent to which these missiles and these weaponry are going to harm us when they're in the hands of much more powerful actors. Please propose.